By 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, the RMS Titanic would disappear beneath the North Atlantic. Over 500 people would be gone with it. But 24 hours earlier, none of this was inevitable. At that exact moment, the largest moving object ever built by human hands was still considered unsinkable. Passengers were dining. The crew was confident. The ship was on schedule. Nothing suggested that within one rotation of the Earth, the world would change forever. The RMS Titanic was not just a ship. It was a statement. At the time of her maiden voyage, she represented the peak of industrial achievement, luxury, and human ambition. Owned by the White Star Line and built in Belfast, she was 882 feet long, weighed over 46,000 tons, and could carry more than 2,400 people. Her interiors rivaled the finest hotels in Europe. First-class passengers enjoyed gilded dining rooms, Turkish baths, and a grand staircase that became iconic even before the disaster. But the Titanic was not built only for the wealthy. She also carried hundreds of third-class passengers, mostly immigrants seeking new lives in America. For them, the ship was hope in motion. On April 10, 1912, the Titanic departed Southampton, England, bound for New York City. She made brief stops in Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, Ireland, before heading into open ocean. By the morning of April 14th, the ship had been at sea for 4 days. The voyage had been smooth. The weather was calm. There had been no mechanical issues. Captain Edward Smith, a veteran of the White Star Line with decades of experience, was scheduled to retire after this trip. For him, this was meant to be a triumphant final voyage. April 14, 1912 began like any other day aboard the Titanic. Passengers woke to the gentle roll of the Atlantic. Stewards delivered breakfast. The ship's band rehearsed. Children played on the decks. In the wireless room, operators sent and received personal messages from passengers to loved ones on land. The Titanic was, by all appearances, operating exactly as designed. But the North Atlantic in April is not a forgiving place. The water temperature hovered just above freezing. And that year, an unusually large number of icebergs had drifted south from the Arctic, carried by ocean currents into the shipping lanes. Other vessels in the area had already sent warnings. The Titanic had received several of them. None were treated as urgent. At this point, ice was considered a known hazard, routine, manageable. The ship's speed remained unchanged. The course remained unchanged. Confidence remained unchanged. This was the last full day the RMS Titanic would ever see. What follows is the reconstruction of those final 24 hours, told not through speculation or drama, but through the documented movements, decisions, and silences that led to one of the most studied disasters in human history. April 14, 1912, 2:20 a.m., 24 hours before the sinking. At this moment, most passengers aboard the Titanic were asleep. The ship cut through calm waters at roughly 21 knots. The night watch maintained their posts. In the boiler rooms deep below deck, firemen shoveled coal into massive furnaces, keeping the engines running without pause. Everything was routine. By mid-morning, the ship had come alive. Breakfast was served in the dining saloons. First-class passengers enjoyed elaborate meals: eggs, bacon, fresh fruit, pastries, coffee, and tea. In second class, the fare was simpler but still generous. Third-class passengers received porridge, bread, and jam. The differences were stark, but everyone ate well. Stewards moved efficiently through the corridors, attending to requests, delivering messages, preparing cabins. For them, this was simply work. Another day, another crossing. On deck, passengers strolled in the fresh air. Some wrapped themselves in coats and blankets against the Atlantic chill. Others stood at the railing, watching the endless horizon. The ocean was unusually calm. One passenger later described it as resembling a sheet of glass. There were no waves, no wind, just the steady hum of the engines and the rhythmic splash of water against the hull. Captain Edward Smith attended to his duties. He reviewed navigation reports, conferred with officers, and made his presence known among the passengers. He was well-liked, experienced, respected. There was no indication of concern. The Titanic was performing beautifully. She was making good time. The weather was cooperating. Everything pointed toward an on-schedule arrival in New York. In the Marconi wireless room, operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride worked in shifts, managing an overwhelming volume of passenger messages. Wealthy travelers wanted to send greetings, conduct business, share details of their voyage. The system was busy, almost constantly. This would later become significant. But at the time, it was just the normal demand of a luxury liner carrying some of the richest people in the world. By early afternoon, the ship continued westward. Lunch was served. Passengers socialized in the lounges, libraries, and smoking rooms. Some wrote letters. Some napped. Some played cards. Children ran along the decks under the supervision of nannies. The Titanic had become a floating world, self-contained and orderly. At this point, there was still no reason to believe this day would be anything other than ordinary. Around 9:00 a.m., the Titanic received her first ice warning of the day. The message came from the steamer Coronia, reporting icebergs and field ice in a position roughly along the Titanic's projected route. Captain Smith acknowledged it. The information was noted. But ice warnings in April were not unusual. Ships encountered ice in the North Atlantic regularly. Experience suggested it could be navigated around. The warning was posted for officers to see, then routine operations continued. At 1:42 p.m., a second message arrived. This one came from the Baltic, another White Star Line vessel. It reported ice, large bergs, and field ice at coordinates further along the Titanic's path. Captain Smith read this message personally. He showed it to J. Bruce Ismay, managing director of the White Star Line, who happened to be aboard as a passenger. Ismay pocketed the message and continued socializing. It was later returned to the bridge. Again, no course change was made. No reduction in speed was ordered. By early evening, the temperature had dropped noticeably. Passengers retreated indoors. Officers on the bridge could feel the cold intensifying. This was expected. Cold air often indicated proximity to ice. At 5:50 p.m., another warning came in, this time from the SS America, reporting 2 large icebergs near the same area the Titanic was approaching. The message was received but not delivered to the bridge. It was filed with other routine traffic. At 7:30 p.m., the wireless operator received yet another ice warning, this one from the Californian. A cargo steamer stopped in ice roughly 50 miles to the north. The message described field ice and bergs directly in the area. It was delivered to the bridge. Officers noted it. Still no action was taken. The Titanic's speed remained steady at approximately 22 knots, nearly full speed. At the time, this raised no concern. The ship was considered strong. The night was clear. Visibility seemed excellent. The lookouts in the crow's nest had been briefed to watch for ice. Captain Smith had decades of experience in these waters. Confidence in the ship's design, in the crew's competence, and in standard maritime practice overrode caution. In hindsight, each ignored warning would prove critical. But in those hours, they were treated as background noise, minor details in an otherwise flawless voyage. By 9 p.m., night had fully settled over the Atlantic. The sky was clear, filled with stars. There was no moon. The ocean remained eerily calm. Passengers had finished dinner and moved to the lounges for drinks, music, and conversation. In first class, the band played ragtime and waltzes. Card games continued in the smoking room. Women gathered in the reception areas, wrapped in furs and evening gowns. The atmosphere was relaxed, elegant, and entirely normal. Captain Smith made a final inspection of the bridge before retiring to his cabin. He left instructions with the officers on watch. If conditions became uncertain, he was to be notified immediately. Then he left. Second Officer Charles Lytler took over the watch. He was aware of the ice warnings. He knew the ship was entering the reported danger zone. But visibility seemed good. The sea was flat. Ice, he believed, would be spotted in time. At 9:40 p.m., another message came through from the SS Mesaba. It was specific, urgent, and detailed. It described heavy pack ice and large icebergs directly in the Titanic's path. The wireless operator, Jack Phillips, was overwhelmed with passenger messages. He was trying to clear a backlog. The Mesaba's warning was received but never taken to the bridge. It sat in the wireless room, unread by the officers who needed it most. At 10 p.m., lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee took their positions in the crow's nest. They had been told to watch for ice, but they had no binoculars. The pair that belonged in the nest had been misplaced before the voyage began. This detail would later be examined extensively. At the time, it was simply an inconvenience. Fleet and Lee relied on their eyes, straining to see into the darkness ahead. At 11 p.m., the temperature had dropped to near freezing. Officers on the bridge could see their breath. The cold was sharp, biting. This was another sign of proximity to ice. Still, the ship's speed remained unchanged. The engines pushed the Titanic forward at over 22 knots. At this point, the outcome was already being determined by forces larger than individual decisions. Geography, ocean currents, timing, and a series of small oversights were converging. The margin for error was shrinking. No one on board realized it yet. At 11:40 p.m., lookout Frederick Fleet saw something emerge from the darkness ahead. At first it was a shadow, then a shape. Then unmistakable ice. A massive iceberg directly in the ship's path. Fleet rang the warning bell 3 times and grabbed the telephone to the bridge. The call was answered immediately. Fleet said 3 words. Iceberg, right ahead. First Officer William Murdoch was in command on the bridge. He reacted within seconds. He ordered the engines reversed and the ship turned hard to port. The Titanic began to shift, slowly, too slowly. The iceberg was less than 500 yards away. At 22 knots, the ship was covering that distance in seconds. The turn was not fast enough. At approximately 11:40 p.m., the Titanic's starboard side made contact with the iceberg. It was not a violent collision. There was no loud crash. Most passengers felt only a slight vibration, a scraping sensation or nothing at all. Some described it as the ship running over a rough patch of water. Others compared it to the feeling of a train switching tracks. On deck, chunks of ice fell onto the forward well deck. A few passengers came out to investigate. Some picked up pieces of ice as souvenirs. Most returned to their cabins or their activities, assuming the incident was minor. Below the waterline, the reality was catastrophic. The iceberg had opened the ship's hull along a series of compartments. Water was flooding in at an unstoppable rate. The watertight doors closed automatically, but it made no difference. The damage extended across too many compartments. The ship's designers had planned for 4 flooded compartments. 5 were breached. The Titanic could not survive this. Captain Smith was summoned to the bridge immediately. He ordered a full inspection. Within minutes, the ship's carpenter and other crew members reported flooding in multiple areas. Thomas Andrews, the Titanic's designer, was also aboard. He was brought to assess the damage. After reviewing the reports, Andrews gave Captain Smith a devastating conclusion. The ship would sink. He estimated they had 1 hour, perhaps 2 at most. It was now approximately midnight. The Titanic had entered her final act. At 12:05 a.m., Captain Smith gave the order to uncover the lifeboats and prepare for evacuation. Wireless operators were instructed to send distress signals. The first CQD went out at 12:15 a.m. Women and children were to board the lifeboats first. But there was a critical problem. The Titanic carried lifeboats for only 1,178 people. There were over 2,200 aboard. Confusion, disbelief, and a lack of urgency meant many boats departed only partially filled. Passengers refused to believe the ship could actually sink. Some lifeboats were lowered with empty seats while hundreds remained on deck. At 2:05 a.m., the last lifeboat left the Titanic. Over 1,500 people were still aboard. The ship's bow was fully submerged. The stern began to rise out of the water. The lights, which had remained on throughout the evacuation, suddenly went dark. Then at approximately 2:20 a.m., the Titanic broke apart and sank. The frigid water killed most of those who went into it within minutes. The Carpathia, responding to the distress calls, arrived at 4 a.m. She rescued 706 survivors from the lifeboats. Over 1,500 lives were lost. Among the dead were passengers from all classes, crew members, Captain Smith, Thomas Andrews, and most of the ship's band, who continued playing music until the very end. The disaster led to immediate changes in maritime safety. International regulations were rewritten. Ships were required to carry enough lifeboats for everyone aboard. Radio watch was mandated 24 hours a day. The International Ice Patrol was established to monitor iceberg danger in the North Atlantic. The Titanic's wreck was not located until 1985, resting 2.5 miles below the surface. Some questions remain unanswered. Why were so many warnings ignored? Why was the ship traveling at full speed? Why were lifeboats launched half empty? The answers lie somewhere between human error, overconfidence, and a series of small decisions that compounded into catastrophe. This was day falling. One day, everything changes.